Shannon Christian was born on April 29, 1985 in Nacogdoches, Texas. Her family relocated to Knoxville, Tennessee when she was in grade school, eventually settling in Farragut, a suburb on the western edge of Knox County along Kingston Pike. Farragut is widely considered one of the more desirable communities in the Knoxville metro area, characterized by well-maintained neighborhoods and strong schools. Shannon attended Farragut High School and, by all accounts, was an engaged, warm-hearted student. She was deeply attached to her family, particularly her father, Gary, who worked at Rick McGill's Toyota dealership in Knoxville. Her mother, Dina, would later describe her as central to the entire family's world. Shannon also had a younger brother, Chase. After graduating from high school, she enrolled at the University of Tennessee, where she declared a major in sociology. By January 2007, she was a senior in the final stretch of her undergraduate degree and on track to graduate in May of that year. Additionally, she had recently begun dating Christopher Newsom, having been together for just a few months at that point. Because the relationship was relatively new, her family and Newsom's family were essentially strangers to one another at the time. Chris was born on September 21, 1983 in Knoxville, Tennessee to Hugh and Mary. He was a standout baseball player throughout his youth, having played for his high school team. After high school, Chris attended Pellissippi State Technical Community College. By his early 20s, he had left formal education and channeled his energy into becoming a carpenter and craftsman. A third key individual in this story is named LaMarcus Davidson. He was born in 1981 and grew up in Memphis. His childhood was deeply unstable. His mother was described as struggling with serious issues that left her unable to provide a stable home life, and his father was absent. By the time he was a teenager, he had been removed from his home environment entirely. He was placed at the West Tennessee Children's Home, a facility for children in difficult circumstances. From there, a couple named Carl and Florence Rudd took Davidson into their home and attempted to give him structure, stability, and a real chance at a decent life. At this moment in time, several officials and other adults noted that while Davidson was troubled, he showed positive behavior given the right environment. However, he ultimately descended into a criminal lifestyle in his teens. Court records established that by the time he was roughly 19 years old, he had already been convicted of aggravated robbery and was later convicted of carjacking. He served a 5-year prison sentence and was released on parole in August 2006. Immediately afterward, he was dealing illegal substances and operating within the same circle of criminals that had defined his earlier years. Shortly after his release, he settled in Knoxville along with his half-brother Latalvis Cobbins and a mutual friend named George Thomas, who was also referred to as Detroit. They took up residence at 2316 Chipman Street, a rental home in a lower-income section of East Knoxville. Along with the two other men, Cobbins' girlfriend Vanessa Coleman and a man named Eric Boyd also often visited the location. In January of 2007, it's believed that Davidson and members of his group were involved in a string of robberies in the local area. On Saturday, January 6, 2007, Shannon and Chris planned to have dinner together, then go over to a friend's apartment to celebrate a birthday. At around 8 p.m., Chris arrived at the complex. He parked his truck in the lot, went up to Shannon's apartment, and then the two came back downstairs together and made their way towards Shannon's white Toyota 4Runner. Unbeknownst to the couple, the two were being watched. Chris was standing at the driver's side door while Shannon was either inside the driver's seat or standing outside next to Chris. That's when multiple armed individuals converged on the two and forced them into the Toyota at gunpoint. Both victims had their hands bound behind their backs and were blindfolded before being shoved into the back seat. The Toyota was then commandeered by the assailants. The SUV was driven away from the Washington Ridge complex and traveled approximately 6 miles southeast, arriving at Davidson's home. At around 11 p.m. that same night, two of Chris's friends made their way to Shannon's apartment complex after failing to get in contact with the couple. When they arrived, they found something they deemed as worrying. They found Chris's truck, but could not find Shannon's Toyota. Shortly after midnight, at approximately 12:30 a.m. on January 7th, Xavier Jenkins, a driver for a garbage company named Waste Connections, arrived at his workplace and observed an unusual scene. The lights inside side, 2316 Chipman Street, were on. The house appeared oddly busy for the early morning hour. A white Toyota was also parked directly in front of the house with its lights on. Parked behind the Toyota was another vehicle, later identified by law enforcement as a white Pontiac Sunbird belonging to Nicole Mathis, a cousin of Eric Boyd, who had loaned the car to Boyd just days earlier on or around January 4th. Mathis would later testify she did not get the car back until January 8th. Jenkins initially paid little attention, but later, as he sat in his parked vehicle, he observed the Toyota drive slowly past him. The vehicle slowed down for roughly 20 seconds, as if the occupants were deliberately watching him. He observed 4 men inside the vehicle. At approximately 1:45 a.m., a resident who lived roughly 1 block from Davidson's residence heard 3 pops coming from the direction of the nearby Norfolk Southern Railroad tracks. These sounds were later confirmed to be the gunshots that killed Chris. The assault on the couple had begun immediately after the two were brought inside Davidson's home. Chris had been sodomized with an object and assaulted by one of the men. According to one account from one of the perpetrators, Cobbins claimed that Davidson told him earlier that day he simply wanted to steal a car. Back home, Davidson led Channon into his bedroom, exchanged brief words with Boyd, and then told him to leave the room. Cobbins believes that Davidson told him to let Chris go. What followed was the transportation of Chris to a hillside where a mangled dog leash was discovered, believed to have been used to force Chris to cooperate. At the time of his death, his hands were bound by shoelace, his feet were tied by the ankles with a belt, he was blindfolded with a bandana, and he was gagged with a sock. He was also barefoot and only had on a shirt and underwear. Medical examiners stated that they believed Chris had survived the first 2 gunshots, which struck him in the neck and back. It was the 3rd shot where the firearm was pressed against his right ear, which proved to be fatal. His remains were then wrapped in a floral print comforter and doused with gas before being set on fire. At around 7:45 a.m. on January 7th, a Norfolk Southern employee named Roy Thurman saw smoke near the railroad track. About 4 hours later, a train engineer called the police to report seeing a body beside the track. Officers arrived about 10 minutes later and confirmed that the sighting was indeed the remains of a man. While Chris was being executed, Vanessa Coleman was believed to have been left inside the house with Channon holding her captive in a bedroom. When Davidson and the others returned to the house, they committed what officials described as one of the most extreme cases of violence in modern Tennessee history. All of the men brutally sodomized and assaulted Channon while subjecting her to sustained torture. At one point, Channon looked at Davidson and said, "I don't want to die." According to Davidson's own account, he claimed that the couple had voluntarily visited his home to purchase illegal substances. This allegation was ultimately dismantled and was so offensive to Shannon's family that it inspired the later passage of the Shannon-Christian Act in 2014, which restricts defense attorneys from portraying victims in a negative light at trial. During the torture, the culprits also poured bleach down Shannon's throat as well as scrubbed it against her battered and bleeding private area. Despite this attempt at removing DNA evidence, analysis still identified Davidson and Cobbins as contributors of the DNA left behind. After the assault, Channon was hogtied, wrapped in several trash bags, and folded into a trash can where she was covered with bed sheets. At this moment in time, she was still alive, but barely. She had been attacked so viciously that she did not have the strength or capability to call out for help or free herself. Around 11 p.m. that same day, January 7th, Davidson drove Shannon's car to his girlfriend's apartment, Daphne Sutton. He stayed the night with Sutton on January 7th and remained at her apartment through the following day. He had taken Chris's personal belongings and gifted them to Sutton. He was also seen wearing Chris's Nike shoes and using his cell phone. Before leaving, Davidson and others had tampered with Shannon's vehicle in an effort to make it less recognizable or traceable, such as removing the stickers that she had kept on the outside of the windows. However, 2 crucial mistakes came in the form of a pack of Newport cigarettes and an envelope bearing a fingerprint left inside the car. Neither Channon nor Chris smoked, and this fingerprint would later be traced back to LaMarcus Davidson. On the morning of January 8th, Nicole Mathis went to retrieve her white Pontiac Sunbird. Boyd was there. When she tried to start the car, fluid was pouring from the engine area. While retrieving her belongings from the damaged vehicle, Mathis found a plastic bag containing small bullets under the front passenger seat. She said she had no knowledge of the bullets and discarded them. As she was at the car, Boyd came out of the apartment and walked past her on the sidewalk, speaking on his cell phone. She heard him say clearly, "I might be in some trouble." By this point, the now missing couple's friends and family had grown deeply concerned. Shannon had not shown up for work and was not answering her phone. At some point, her mother, Dina, found herself flipping through a telephone directory searching for the name Newsom, as she had no contact information for her daughter's boyfriend. She found the listing for Hugh and Mary Newsom in the directory and called them. Upon learning that neither Shannon nor Chris was responding to calls and had been missing, both families filed missing persons reports immediately. As previously mentioned, Chris's remains were discovered by a train engineer, and officials were not able to immediately identify him. But hours later, after receiving news that Chris had gone missing, officials began connecting the dots and suspected that the remains may have belonged to him. While investigators worked the railroad track scene, Shannon's family's search intensified. Gary and Dina contacted her cell phone provider and obtained the last known location from which her phone had pinged off a cell tower. That ping placed her phone near the Cherry Street area in East Knoxville, not far from where Chris's body had just been discovered. Her parents drove to the area themselves and began searching the streets. What they found was Shannon's white Toyota clearly having been tampered with. When officials arrived, they processed the vehicle and quickly began making connections. As mentioned, a fingerprint was linked to Davidson, and investigators quickly realized that he had a known address only a short distance away from where the car had been abandoned. A search warrant for the Chipman Street property was secured, and at 1:40 p.m. on Tuesday, January 9th, officers executed the warrant. The house was unoccupied when they arrived, but they discovered a fully intact crime scene that the perpetrators had made little effort in concealing. 5 minutes after entering, officers discovered Shannon's body inside a trash can in the kitchen. The medical examiner would later testify that the cause of death was positional asphyxiation, meaning she had suffocated slowly after being placed in the garbage. Based on the medical evidence, she had been dead for somewhere between several hours and a full day before she was found. An investigator named Tim Shady processed the garbage bags and found Davidson's palm prints on 3 of the 5 bags wrapping Shannon's body. A box of matching garbage bags was also found nearby, also bearing Davidson's prints. The defense would later argue at trial that Davidson could have touched the bags simply through ordinary household use, but this argument was later debunked. While the police were investigating the crime scene, Cobbins, George Thomas, and Vanessa Coleman had fled Knoxville and traveled to Lebanon, Kentucky. They were not hiding particularly carefully. Cobbins and Thomas had been using a computer at the residence they were staying at to follow news coverage of the murders. When law enforcement moved to arrest them, they found the computer still showing news reports about the killings. When Coleman was arrested on January 11th, she denied being in Knoxville at all during the time of the crimes, claiming that she, Cobbins, and Thomas had left Davidson's house an entire week before the murders. Over the following weeks, Coleman would give multiple additional statements to law enforcement, each one progressively more detailed and damning. In a January 17th interview, she acknowledged that she had seen Shannon Christian blindfolded being led into the house, but insisted she and Cobbins had simply played video games in the living room and had never seen or heard Shannon again. In that same interview, she said that Davidson had tied Christian to an air mattress in his bedroom, and that she had heard Shannon tell Davidson to stop whatever he was doing. She claimed to have told Davidson she was going to call the police, and that he responded by threatening to kill her if she did. By January 28th, Coleman had added yet another crucial detail. She stated that Davidson had forced her to physically check Shannon's pulse. Among Coleman's belongings recovered at the time of her arrest was a journal, and inside it an entry dated January 9th, 2007, 3 days after the murders, that forensic document examiners confirmed was written in her own hand. The entry read, "Last night was one of a kind. Let's talk about adventures. I had one hell of an adventure since I've been in the Big TN. It's a crazy world these days, but I love the fun adventures and lessons that I've learned. It's going to be a long, interesting year." Also recovered among the belongings was a purse containing several of Shannon's personal items. Unlike his colleagues, Davidson had not fled to Kentucky. He remained in the Knoxville area, moving between locations, relying on associates to shelter him as law enforcement closed in. Police had identified Boyd as an associate of Davidson's and contacted him seeking information on Davidson's whereabouts. Boyd cooperated initially, or at least appeared to. He directed investigators to a vacant house where he said Davidson might be found. What Boyd did not tell investigators was that he had been actively helping Davidson hide and move around the city. On the morning of January 11th, Boyd left the house where Davidson was hiding to get food for him. Before leaving, he gave Davidson his own cell phone so the two could stay in contact. That was the moment law enforcement moved. Officers arrived at the location and arrested Davidson. They recovered 2 critical pieces of evidence, including Chris's shoes and a .22 caliber revolver. Ballistic analysis would later link the revolver to the casings and bullets recovered both at the Chipman Street house and from Chris's body. Boyd was arrested shortly thereafter and was tried first in court on April 16, 2008. He was convicted of accessory to carjacking, resulting in death, and sentenced to 18 years in federal prison, the maximum allowed. Cobbin stood trial in August 2009 and was found guilty of both murders and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Davidson was convicted on October 28th of the same year on all charges, including 4 capital counts. The jury sentenced him to death. Judge Baumgartner called it one of the most incredibly outrageous, cruel, and inhumane cases this court has ever seen. Davidson was additionally sentenced to 80 years for non-capital charges, to be served consecutively to his death sentences. George Thomas was convicted and sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences without parole, and Vanessa Coleman was tried last in May 2010. She was acquitted of first-degree murder but convicted of lesser facilitation charges and sentenced to 53 years. However, in early 2011, a bombshell emerged that threw the entire case into chaos. It was revealed that Judge Richard Baumgartner, the man who had presided over all 4 state trials, had been severely addicted to prescription painkillers throughout the proceedings. Richard had developed pancreatitis from alcoholism, leading to legitimate prescriptions for oxycodone and hydrocodone. But when prescriptions ran dry, he turned to convicted felons and former probationers for his supply. A woman named Dina Castleman, a graduate of Richard's own drug court program, told the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation that she had been supplying the judge with both pills and intercourse during the murder trials, sometimes during breaks from court and occasionally in his own chambers. Investigators found that Richard had visited Castleman in the hospital during breaks from Davidson's televised trial, and nurses noted she appeared intoxicated after those visits. A second supplier, a felon named Chris Gibson, who was on active probation, told agents that Richard visited his home every 2 to 3 days to buy pills and sometimes made pickups during recesses. The judge's own secretary told investigators that on some days he was so impaired that she had to reschedule court hearings. He quietly resigned in late 2010. In March 2011, he pleaded guilty to a single count of official misconduct, a sentence structured to allow him to avoid jail, keep his pension, and potentially expunge the conviction from his record. He was disbarred in September 2011. Widespread public outrage followed, particularly from the victims' families, who felt the perpetrators now had a path to freedom because of the judge's behavior. On December 1st, 2011, replacement judge John Blackwood granted new trials to all 4 state defendants. After a prolonged legal battle, Davidson and Cobbins kept their original convictions and sentences. However, Thomas and Coleman were granted retrials. During Coleman's retrial, she was convicted of facilitation of aggravated kidnapping, assault, and murder. On February 1st, 2013, she was sentenced to 35 years. On June 4th, Thomas was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences plus 25 years for the assaults. His sentence is set to expire in May 2053. Over a decade after the murders, authorities pursued Boyd on state charges. On March 20th, 2018, a Knox County grand jury issued a 36-count state indictment against Boyd for various counts. His trial began in August 2019. In a notable development, co-defendant George Thomas agreed to testify against Boyd in exchange for a reduction of his own sentence. On August 13th, the jury found Boyd guilty on nearly all 36 counts, including first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms plus 90 years, and all of his subsequent appeals were denied through 2022. David Paul Brown, who would later rename himself as Nathaniel bar-Jonah, was born on February 15, 1957 in Worcester, Massachusetts. He was the youngest of 3 children born to Philip and Tyra. Before he was even born, his entry into the world was marked by an unusual set of circumstances. When Tyra was 3 months pregnant with David, she was involved in a serious vehicle collision while stopping at a red light. Another driver slammed into the back of her vehicle with enough force that she was required to wear a neck brace for the final 6 months of her pregnancy. Whether or not this had any physiological effect on the developing child is unknown, but it was noted by those who later studied David's case as part of the broader context of his early developmental profile. From the very first weeks of his life, David displayed behaviors that alarmed his family. As an infant, he was described as almost impossibly inactive. He would cry incessantly when not being fed, yet showed almost no capacity for voluntary physical movement. His appetite was described by those around him as insatiable. He demanded to be fed constantly, and his refusal to stop crying unless actively eating caused the family enormous stress in the home. The combination of near-total physical inactivity and relentless caloric intake caused David to accumulate weight at a rate so extreme that he became practically immobile as an infant. Beyond his weight, he exhibited another trait that struck his parents and caregivers as deeply abnormal. He had a strong, consistent aversion to being touched. While most infants seek physical comfort through contact, David appeared to resist it or react negatively to it. When he was just 3 weeks old, he experienced hydrocephalus, a dangerous medical condition in which an abnormal accumulation of fluid builds up within the cavities of the brain, increasing intracranial pressure and potentially affecting brain development. Medical records confirmed this condition, though no documentation could be located indicating that he received any significant follow-up treatment or monitoring in response to it. Shortly after David's birth, the family relocated to Lantana, Florida, where his father had accepted employment with McDonnell Douglas, a large defense and aerospace contractor. The family lived there for approximately 6 years, and very little is publicly documented about specific incidents during this Florida period, though accounts from later interviews and psychiatric evaluations confirm that David's compulsive and disturbing behaviors continued. One specific behavior from his childhood began around the age of 6, when David began picking at scabs on his skin until they broke open and bled, and then sucked on the blood from the wound. This was a compulsive and repeated habit that alarmed his teachers at school so much that school authorities contacted his mother multiple times to report the behavior. But despite these calls, no intervention followed. In 1964, the family moved back to Worcester, Massachusetts after Philip took a job as a heavy equipment mechanic at a local construction firm. By now, David was 7 years old. According to accounts David himself provided to psychiatrists and therapists over the years, home life was not stable. He described his father as strict and frequently violent. Philip reportedly beat David with a thick leather belt on a regular basis, motivated by 2 primary concerns. These included a fear that David would grow up to be homosexual and his son's deeply ingrained habit of stealing. David was described by multiple sources as a compulsive thief from an early age. He stole from his siblings, other children, and from anyone whose possessions he wanted without remorse. The beatings appear to have done nothing to curb this behavior. It was during the summer of 1964, before the family had fully settled back into their life in Massachusetts, and while they were still in Florida, that David committed what is documented as his first known violent act against another person at the age of 7. In late July, he approached a 5-year-old girl who lived in the neighborhood. He told her that he had received a Ouija board as a birthday gift, claimed to have the ability to predict the future. The girl, intrigued, agreed to come and see it. David led her down into his basement, and once they were inside and out of sight, his demeanor changed immediately. Rather than producing the board, David wrapped his hands around the girl's throat and began to choke her. She fought back and screamed loudly enough that the sounds of the struggle carried up through the floor of the house. His mother, Tyra, heard the commotion, rushed down the stairs, and physically pulled her son off the child. The girl was rescued before she could be seriously harmed or killed. David received little to no punishment for what he had done. Tyra simply slapped her son and more or less brushed off the event after her son gave her a so-called explanation. As far as the victim's family went, it seems that they either chose not to press charges or were hindered in some other way in doing so. Regardless, the matter was dropped quietly and quickly. By the time David was 13 years old, his actions had escalated dramatically. In January 1970, he approached a 6-year-old boy who lived in his neighborhood. Using a similar tactic that he had employed against the girl, he told the boy that he wanted to go sledding together. The boy agreed and went along with him to a nearby hill. Once they had reached an isolated spot, David violated him. Once again, there is no documented evidence in available records that David was charged, prosecuted, or referred for any mental health evaluation as a result of this attack. At some point in the mid-1970s, David attempted another attack on 2 boys who were riding their bicycles on the street near his home. He approached them and attempted to lure them to a nearby cemetery, intending to harm them there once he had them in a secluded area. The 2 boys grew suspicious and fled the scene. Another incident occurred at approximately age 15, where David cut individual letters and words out of magazines and assembled them into a note which he sent or delivered to 2 different boys from nearby Webster, Massachusetts. The note offered them $20 and a vague promise of a surprise if they would come meet him at a cemetery. The boy's mother discovered the note before her children could respond to it. Critically, the mother declined to press charges or investigate further. Her reasoning was that she believed David would benefit more from psychiatric treatment than from criminal prosecution. By the spring of 1974, David was 17 years old and had still received no psychiatric intervention and no criminal consequences for his crimes. In May of that year, he traveled to Woodstock, Connecticut, and attempted to abduct a 9-year-old girl named Mary Patrone. The attempt failed because Mary fought back and screamed loudly enough to deter him, causing him to release her and flee. She was shaken but physically unharmed. David was never arrested for this incident, and no charges were filed. It's worth noting that a year before this attack, a 7-year-old girl named Janice Pocket vanished from Tolland, Connecticut under circumstances that officials later linked to David. Pocket left her home on July 26, 1973 to retrieve a butterfly she had left under a rock in a wooded area near Rhodes Road, less than a mile from her house. Her bicycle was found by her mother 30 minutes later, but Janice herself was gone, and she was never found. At the time of this event, David would have been 16 and lived approximately 20 miles away in Webster, Massachusetts. Then in late March 1975, David escalated his violence to a degree that finally forced a criminal consequence, though an inadequate one. He dressed in clothing to impersonate a police officer and approached an 8-year-old boy named Richard O'Connor who was walking to school. O'Connor believed that he was talking to a legitimate officer and complied with his instruction to get into the car. David drove O'Connor to an abandoned area, then assaulted and strangled the boy. It was by pure luck that a neighbor who happened to glance out her window at precisely the right moment and called law enforcement. Officers began searching the area, and a patrol car spotted a vehicle matching the description of David's, parked away from other cars in a lot. The officer called for backup before approaching and ordered David out of the vehicle. O'Connor was found inside, bloodied, and on the brink of death. He ultimately survived, and David was arrested. According to the Great Falls Tribune, he only received a sentence of 1 year of probation for pleading guilty to choking the boy. The next assault occurred just days before David's high school graduation while he was still on probation. He drove to Hartford, Connecticut, and once again impersonated a police officer. This time, his target was a 9-year-old girl whom he had convinced to get into his vehicle, where he assaulted her. She began vomiting and convulsing from the physical trauma, which alarmed David enough to throw her out of the car and speed away. A witness who was nearby saw what happened and managed to obtain the car's license plate number. David was subsequently arrested for the assault. What makes this incident particularly alarming is what followed. News of this event was never properly communicated to his probation officer, and thus it was almost as though the assault had never even occurred. In May 1976, David's probationary period formally concluded and he received a formal letter thanking him for his cooperation. In September of the next year, around the age of 19 or 20, weighing around 375 pounds, David approached two more boys, leaving a movie theater in Shrewsbury, Massachusetts. He claimed to be an undercover FBI agent and convinced the pair to get inside his car. David handcuffed and assaulted them and even repeatedly jumped on the chest of one of the boys with his full body weight. He believed the boy to be dead and placed the other one in the trunk of his car before driving off. The first boy regained consciousness, got help, and the police quickly found and arrested David. The boy in the trunk was recovered alive. For this crime, he was convicted of attempted murder and given the maximum sentence of 18 to 20 years at the Massachusetts Correctional Institution. He was later transferred to Bridgewater State Hospital after sharing violent and disturbing fantasies with a prison psychologist and was committed there indefinitely for evaluation and treatment. One therapist documented that his fantasies were bizarre and often extended to consuming the flesh of another person. Despite this documented record, alongside a prior history of repeated violent crimes against children, 4 mental health professionals testified at a parole hearing in 1984 that David was no longer a threat to society. Judge Walter Steele ruled that Massachusetts had failed to prove he was dangerous and ordered his release, effective February 12, 1991. Then on March 22, 1984, while still committed at Bridgewater, Brown legally changed his name to Nathaniel Benjamin Levy bar-Jonah, telling friends and relatives he wanted to experience what it felt like to be persecuted as a Jewish person. Though he was of Scandinavian descent, his parents were active in the Assemblies of God. Administrative delays pushed his actual release to July 1991. But for the sake of keeping the video easier to follow, I'm going to continue referring to him as David. On August 9th, 1991, he found himself in Oxford, Massachusetts, near a post office. A woman named Nancy Surprise had briefly left her 7-year-old son alone in the car while she went inside to run an errand. David spotted the boy sitting alone in the vehicle and climbed inside and sat down on top of the child. The boy's mother returned from the post office and, along with other nearby witnesses, ran to the car. Their arrival caused David to flee before he could complete whatever he intended to do. A responding officer recognized David from a physical description that matched arrest records from more than 15 years earlier, and he was apprehended. When first questioned, David offered an explanation so absurd that it speaks to either his contempt for law enforcement or his confidence that he would face no meaningful consequence. His claim was that he had entered the stranger's car to get out of the rain. He was pressed further and admitted that his actual intention had been to kill the boy. The Worcester County District Attorney's Office reviewed the case and determined once again that the appropriate response to a man who had just admitted to intending to kill a child was not incarceration, but relocation. The deal offered was as follows. David could plead guilty to a charge of simple assault and battery, and in exchange, he would receive a 2-year probationary period and was required to move to Great Falls, Montana, where his mother had relocated. No jail time, no psychiatric recommitment, and no notification to Montana authorities about the man they were about to receive. David accepted the deal and moved west. After relocating, David struggled to find steady employment, cycling through a variety of odd jobs over the years. What he did with considerable energy and enthusiasm was build what his neighbors would later describe as a child's paradise in his garage. He began amassing an extensive collection of children's toys, games, and pop culture memorabilia, including Star Wars action figures, trading cards, Freddy Krueger dolls, and other items. He sold these at yard sales and out of his garage, and these sales regularly attracted large numbers of neighborhood children. For 9 years, neighbors in Great Falls knew him as the large, friendly man who sold collectibles out of his garage and always had children around. In December 1993, approximately 2 years after David's arrival in Montana, an 8-year-old boy whom he had been babysitting accused him of inappropriately touching him. He was charged, and what followed was a baffling statement. He argued that if he had actually done what he was being accused of to the boy, he would have killed him. His attorney argued separately that the right to a speedy trial had been violated. The judge agreed, and the case was dismissed on procedural grounds without a ruling, and David remained free. According to court documents, he was charged with another assault on an 8-year-old boy in 1994. Then on February 6, 1996, another incident occurred involving a 10-year-old named Zachary Ramsey. He lived with his mother in an apartment building in the city and walked to Whittier Elementary School along a route that took him through the alleyway near the 400 block of North 4th Street. He left home at approximately 7:34 a.m. He was wearing a blue denim jacket, a blue football jersey with Ramsey printed across the back in gold letters, jeans, and black high-top sneakers. But he never arrived at school. Multiple witnesses would later come forward to place both Ramsey and David in or near that alley during the window between approximately 7:15 and 7:45 a.m. A family of 3 who lived in an apartment that looked down onto the alleyway reported seeing Ramsey in the alley that morning, and also reported seeing an off-white 4-door car nearly run him over. Another witness who lived near the far end of the alleyway reported seeing Ramsey crying, with a large, visibly upset, obese adult male wearing a police uniform walking a few feet behind him. When Ramsey failed to appear for class that morning, school officials contacted his mother. She filed a missing persons report later that afternoon. Detective Bill Belushi was assigned to the case and began building the investigation. The FBI provided a list of local registered offenders to Bill to assist with potential suspect identification, but David was not on it because Massachusetts had never properly flagged or registered him when he was transferred to Montana. Despite this, Bill focused his suspicion on David early in the investigation. He requested a search warrant for the residence David shared with his mother shortly after the disappearance based on the witness accounts, but the request was denied. Bill reapplied for a new search warrant and was again denied. While Bill was fighting for access to the home, David moved out and got his own apartment. Investigations conducted years later determined that on February 6, 1996, David had access to his mother's off-white 4-door 1978 Toyota Corolla, precisely matching the vehicle description provided by witnesses in the alley. Further investigation revealed that his mother and brother had been out of town on the day of the disappearance, attending a funeral. David did not have an alibi for where he was at the time frame, and yet the warrants had been denied. Throughout the years following the disappearance, David continued operating in the Great Falls community with almost no visible disruption to his routine. One neighbor, Deborah Baker, later told reporters that David had cooked spaghetti sauce for her and her sons, telling her it was made with venison from deer hunting. She told him the meat tasted like something that had gone off, and described it as funny tasting. He responded by getting angry and throwing the entire pot of food in the trash. Baker recalled that he had repeatedly requested to take her son, Lucas, on weekend trips alone, which she consistently declined. When she later learned what investigators suspected was in those dishes, she reeled in disgust. A former roommate of David's later described finding items of clothing in his apartment that appeared to match what Ramsey was wearing on the morning he vanished, along with bloody gloves. A separate former roommate stated that David had spontaneously brought up Ramsey on multiple occasions in casual conversation. Once, a few days before the disappearance, and again afterwards, when David stated that Ramsey would never be found because he had been, quote, chopped up, and the parts scattered in different locations. Then on December 13th, 1999, David was spotted outside an elementary school in Great Falls for the 3rd time within a single week. Officers who responded noted that he was wearing a makeshift police uniform and was carrying a toy gun, a badge, and 2 cans of pepper spray. He had been standing near the school watching children. Bill and the Montana Attorney General's office moved immediately. David was charged with impersonating a law enforcement officer and carrying a concealed weapon. On December 15th, a judge finally approved a search warrant to search David's apartment and his mother's residence. What investigators found on December 15th was deeply alarming, even before the more significant searches to come 2 days later. They found various items that could be used to impersonate a police officer, a pulley system, 2 photo albums with cutout images of children, an article on autoerotic asphyxia, and more. Among the most striking items found in the apartment was a handwritten list of 54 names, headed with the title Lake Webster, a reference to the body of water where David had grown up. The names on the list were identified through subsequent investigation as predominantly boys he had known or interacted with during his youth in Massachusetts. 3 of the names on the list were those of specific boys David had already been convicted of abducting and assaulting between 1975 and 1977. The list also included ages for most of the individuals named, ranging from 5 to 17 years old. At the bottom of the list among the entries was a name written differently from the others, Zachary Ramsey. Next to that name was the word died. Another chilling piece of evidence came from a collection of notebooks filled with what appeared to be arbitrary characters and strings of text. The FBI was brought in and analysts worked for several months before successfully decoding the material. What the decoded writing revealed was a detailed record of David's interior world. The notebooks described in explicit terms torturing and eating children. They also contained a section of what appeared to be recipes, referencing specific methods of preparing body parts for consumption. The decoded journals also contained references to David serving these dishes to his neighbors. Separate from the physical evidence recovered in the searches, investigators developed an additional line of circumstantial evidence through David's financial records. He was documented as a voracious eater who consistently exceeded 300 pounds. Yet financial records showed that for nearly a month following Ramsey's 1996 disappearance, David made no significant grocery store purchases. Shortly after that period, he began hosting the cookouts and serving meat dishes to neighbors. These were the same meals that multiple guests described as tasting peculiar or repulsive, and which David attributed to deer hunting. He owned no rifle, possessed no hunting license, and had never hunted deer at any point in his life. When investigators excavated one of the garages, they sifted through nearly 2 tons of dirt and recovered 21 fragments of human bones. DNA analysis determined that the bones belonged to an African American boy estimated to be between 8 and 13 years of age. This boy has never been identified. When investigators subsequently attempted to examine the sewer pipes beneath another former residence of David's, the property owner informed them that all of the pipes had been replaced after he had moved out, because they had been constantly getting clogged. These pipes were never forensically examined. On July 5, 2000, Montana police formally charged David with the kidnapping and murder of Zachary Ramsey, along with the kidnapping and assault of 3 other boys. Prosecutors announced they were seeking the death penalty. He appeared in court through television from the county jail and entered pleas of not guilty to all charges. He was held on $1.7 million bail. He was ultimately sentenced to 130 years in prison without the possibility of parole. During his trial, 36-year-old Mary, the girl he had attempted to abduct in 1974, recognized David and came forward to identify him, but the statute of limitations had long expired and he could not be charged for that crime. In December 2004, the Montana Supreme Court reviewed the appeal of his conviction and the sentence and turned it down. Then on the morning of April 13, 2008, David was found unresponsive in his cell at Montana State Prison. He was 51 years old. A post-mortem examination revealed significant levels of LDL cholesterol in his arteries, and the cause of death was determined to be a massive heart attack. Throughout this entire time, he maintained his innocence. 3 years later, Zachary Ramsey was declared legally dead in 2011 over the objections of his mother. David is known to have traveled regularly to Massachusetts, Arkansas, Colorado, Florida, Michigan, Washington State, and Wyoming. He was also investigated for possible crimes in the Canadian provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan, where he spent time during the 1990s, though police found no confirmed links to unsolved cases in those regions, and a list of 22 suspected victims remains.